What if the real problem at Ferrari was never the car, the pace, or even the strategy, but the culture itself? Lewis Jamilton's explosive message to his engineer did more than expose a single failure in communication. It tore the veil off a system that appears to protect favoritism while silencing one of the sport's greatest minds. Is Ferrari so obsessed with preserving its internal hierarchy that it is willing to sacrifice the performance of a legend to maintain control? And more dangerously, how many times before has this happened, buried under layers of tradition and pride? This is not just about one radio message. This is about a team unwilling to treat two champions equally. And Jamilton, once again, may be the only one brave enough to say what everyone else is too afraid to admit. The mood inside Ferrari's headquarters in Maranello shifted abruptly when Lewis Jamilton made a move that no one in the paddock, nor within the team's own close circles, saw coming. After months of navigating political silence, technical discrepancies, and strategic indifference, the seven-time world champion walked into a private engineering review and dropped a bombshell. He had personally commissioned an independent aerodynamic analysis of the SF-24's airflow instability. Without seeking permission, without alerting senior figures, Jamilton had used his own resources to verify what he had long suspected. There was a fundamental design flaw in the rear suspension linkage that was being ignored, and it was costing the car vital balance at high load. The document he placed on the table was not conjecture. It was a full technical breakdown from a third-party simulation firm in Stuttgart, one respected in both aviation and automotive sectors, with data models more advanced than what most Formula One teams even had access to. The findings were conclusive. Ferrari's rear platform was behaving inconsistently under lateral stress, and this behavior disproportionately affected performance based on driving style, explaining why Jamilton struggled with feedback loops that Leclerc had learned to mask. No shouting followed. No angry rebuttals. Just silence. A kind of silence that only truth can generate. What made this move even more devastating for Ferrari's internal hierarchy was the method. Jamilton had bypassed politics, tradition, and pride. He had brought facts, not feelings. And more importantly, he had revealed that his trust in the team's internal processes had eroded enough that he sought validation outside its walls. It was not just an engineering wake-up call. It was a cultural rupture. And for those who had underestimated Jamilton's influence or mistaken his restraint for submission, it was the first sign that they were no longer dealing with a mere driver, but with a force capable of reorienting an entire institution from within. What happened next sent quiet shockwaves through the organization. Rather than denying the accuracy of the third-party analysis, several senior engineers, previously reluctant to challenge the dominant narrative shaped by Leclerc's camp, began to cross-reference the independent data with their internal telemetry. For the first time, there was a direct comparison between what Jamilton had been describing in debriefs and what the simulations confirmed. And it aligned perfectly. The vague understeer complaints, the unpredictable snap at mid-corner, the tire degradation spikes, all of it now had a mechanical explanation rooted not in driving style, but in structural inefficiency. In other words, Jamilton had not just identified the problem. He had exposed that the team had failed to even look for it properly. But what made this more than a technical revelation was what it exposed politically. Internally, there had always been whispers that the Ferrari garage was split, not in open warfare, but in quiet bias. Mechanics would joke that the good pieces mysteriously ended up on Leclerc's side first. Setup preferences often leaned toward his feedback, and development paths mirrored his inputs more closely. Publicly, the team denied favoritism. Privately, those inside the garage admitted it was not balanced. Jamilton's move, unapologetically bypassing internal protocol, forced those loyalties into the light. The response from Jamilton's race engineer was telling. During a routine technical call the next day, when the issue of car setup came up, Jamilton interrupted and said calmly, "From now on, let us assume I will validate the truth." It was not arrogance, it was a quiet reclaiming of authority. He had waited, he had trusted, and he had been let down. Now he was resetting the terms. And what was remarkable was not the tone, but the reaction. No one challenged him. Because by then it was clear. He had done what even senior leadership had failed to do. He had exposed the limits of the team's internal accountability, and in doing so, he had redrawn the map of influence within Ferrari. Behind the scenes, whispers of Lewis Jamilton's unexpected initiative began circulating beyond the engineering bay. Across Maranello, figures within marketing, logistics, and even team management found themselves reevaluating what they thought they understood about the dynamics between their drivers. For years, Leclerc had been groomed as the symbolic future of Ferrari, a narrative built on youth, passion, and national loyalty. His face adorned the internal posters, his voice often fronted the team's digital media. But now the spotlight was shifting. Not because Jamilton was asking for it, but because he had earned it decisively through methodical action and irrefutable results. That power shift was not just symbolic. Quietly, two senior aerodynamicists requested reassignment from Leclerc's development branch to Jamilton's side. They cited technical alignment as the official reason, but the truth was clear to anyone paying attention. They wanted to work with the driver who was pushing the limits, not just of the car, but of the system itself. Even the simulator technicians, those who usually operated in anonymity, began leaking praise, describing Jamilton's feedback loops as surgical and multi-layered, far beyond the team's usual benchmarks. And perhaps most revealing of all was the silence from Leclerc. For a driver so often active on social media, known for curated glimpses into his training routines or team lunches, his absence in those days spoke volumes. Some believed he was caught off guard by the momentum shift, unsure how to reassert his position. Others speculated that senior figures had advised him to wait it out, to avoid escalating the divide publicly. But the damage was already done. No matter how Ferrari tried to spin it, no internal review or corporate speech could erase the simple truth: Jamilton had forced the team to face its flaws. And in doing so, he had made it impossible to pretend things were as they were before. While Lewis Jamilton's revelation had already unsettled the foundations of Ferrari's technical department, the ripple effects quickly reached the upper echelons of corporate management. In the days following the data leak, quiet but serious meetings took place behind closed doors. Not to discipline Jamilton, but to determine how such an oversight had gone unchecked under their watch. The tone had changed. What had begun months ago as a glamorous partnership between legacy and legend had evolved into a complex internal power struggle, and the board now saw that Jamilton was not simply a hired champion. He had become the conscience of the team. The most damning realization was that Jamilton's external analysis had been correct on all counts, and worse, the team's own systems had failed to identify the same fault. That begged an uncomfortable question. How many other blind spots existed? How many other decisions had been skewed, not by data, but by favoritism, hierarchy, or ego? In the process of elevating Leclerc as their golden prospect, had they inadvertently trained themselves to dismiss legitimate critique when it came from the outside? From Jamilton, despite his decades of experience? In response, Ferrari launched a quiet internal audit of its engineering workflows and communication pathways. Though it was not publicly announced, several staff members were reassigned, and one senior strategy officer abruptly took indefinite leave. Those inside the paddock interpreted this as the beginning of a reckoning. And through it all, Jamilton remained composed. He did not gloat. He did not leak anything further. He simply continued with his preparation, as if exposing the truth had been a necessity, not a victory. What made this moment so rare in the world of elite motorsport was that a driver, historically expected to drive and obey, had forced a century-old institution to look inward. Jamilton had weaponized data, not drama. Facts, not politics. And now, even those who had once whispered behind his back were watching in silence, knowing they had witnessed a shift not only in authority, but in accountability. This was no longer about one driver's comfort. It was about restoring credibility to a system that had mistaken tradition for excellence. And Jamilton had just proven that excellence does not whisper, it confronts. As the aftershocks of Lewis Jamilton's revelations continued to shake the internal foundations of Ferrari, the atmosphere within the team's Maranello headquarters turned markedly more tense. What had once been a structured and almost ritualistic environment now felt exposed. Its seams laid bare by a veteran who had refused to play along with silent compliance. The corridors, once echoing with rehearsed optimism and unified messaging, became quieter, conversations more guarded. Engineers double-checked their assumptions. Team leads suddenly found themselves questioned in meetings where before, their word went unchallenged. The illusion of infallibility was gone. In this new climate, Jamilton was not seen as a troublemaker by the most astute members of the team. He was seen as a reset button. For too long, operational decisions had revolved not around merit, but around narratives. The myth of Leclerc as the central pillar of Ferrari's future had become so deeply embedded that dissenting views were often filtered out before reaching leadership. Jamilton, with his reputation built on both statistical clarity and uncompromising standards, dismantled that protection with one move. He forced the team to confront whether it was truly optimizing its resources, or simply serving the mythology it had created. And then came the unspoken question that lingered in every meeting, every recalibrated engineering session. If a 7-time world champion had been sidelined by poor communication, misallocated components, or neglected feedback, who else had been ignored? Quietly, younger engineers began speaking up. Junior analysts, previously discouraged from voicing concerns that contradicted the dominant narrative, now had an example to point to. Jamilton's message had cracked the culture open, not with noise, but with precision. Even some of the most loyal Leclerc supporters, including his longtime race strategist, reportedly requested internal reviews of past decisions. asking whether the favoritism they had witnessed was as harmless as they once believed. Because it was no longer just about speed or laps. It was about truth, and whether a team with Ferrari's heritage had the humility to admit when it had fallen short. Jamiltón had proven he was not here to be a figurehead, nor a farewell icon. He was here to hold a mirror to Ferrari and ask the question no one else dared. Are you building a team around facts, or just feelings? In the days that followed Lewis Jamilton's bold intervention, a quiet but meaningful shift began taking place. Not only within Ferrari, but also across the broader paddock. Rivals and pundits alike took note of what had unfolded in Maranello. What at first seemed like a mere disagreement between a driver and his engineer had escalated into a rare display of authority from the cockpit, reshaping internal dynamics in a team famously reluctant to change. And while Ferrari maintained its silence publicly, behind the scenes, the tremors had reached all the way up to the executive board. Jamilton's critique had not been personal, it had been systematic. It was not just about a misstep in communication or a single strategic failure. It was about a culture that had normalized treating his feedback as secondary, despite his unrivaled resume. By choosing to go public in the way he did, Jamiltón took a calculated risk, confronting not just his engineer, but the assumptions that had shaped the team's internal hierarchy. In doing so, he flipped the power dynamic. No longer was he the outsider, joining Ferrari in his final years. Now, he was the standard by which every department was being measured, and the timing could not have been more precise. Just weeks earlier, Ferrari had internally promoted a new head of performance operations, someone widely regarded as close to Leclerc. While that move was meant to reinforce the young driver's central role in the team, Jamilton's actions threw that alignment into question. If performance truly mattered, then accountability had to be blind to favoritism. That was the unspoken message behind Jamilton's decision. Stop protecting comfort zones and start pursuing truth. Behind closed doors, the engineering division quietly began revisiting telemetry reports from the past 3 months, cross-referencing them against driver feedback logs. What they found were not just inconsistencies, but patterns. Instances where Jamilton's observations had flagged issues that had been either delayed or dismissed, while Leclerc's input received immediate action. For a team obsessed with precision, this was an embarrassment. And it forced a difficult reckoning. In the era of data, how had politics prevailed? By exposing that truth, Jamiltón had achieved something few drivers ever manage. He did not just influence setup or car direction. He changed the internal psychology of a team. He reminded Ferrari that a champion does not merely drive fast. He demands clarity, integrity, and the courage to speak even when silence is safer. The ripple effects of Lewis Jamilton's words did not stop at Maranello. They spread across the entire Formula One ecosystem like a silent shockwave. Unspoken in press conferences, but unmistakably present in the subtleties of team behavior. For a sport so often dominated by polished statements and choreographed loyalty, Jamilton's unfiltered response to his engineer had cracked open a rare and uncomfortable honesty. Within days, other teams were reassessing their communication channels, reanalyzing the balance of power between drivers and pit walls. Had they, too, overlooked their veterans in favor of prepackaged narratives? For the first time, former engineers and insiders began to speak anonymously to media outlets, sharing stories that eerily mirrored what was now surfacing at Ferrari. Instances of feedback being logged but not acted upon. Upgrades rushed through for one driver while the other was told to adapt. Even the word favoritism, once cautiously avoided, had entered the conversation with new legitimacy. And Jamiltón, without shouting or staging drama, had made it possible. He had turned the spotlight not on personalities, but on practices. Back at Maranello, the atmosphere had become one of fragile recalibration. Team leaders, once so confident in their direction, were now forced to reconcile the gap between what the data suggested and what had actually been done. Engineers, previously discouraged from offering critical views that might upset the political balance, were cautiously re-engaging. There were meetings without microphones, feedback sessions without agendas, spaces where truth was finally welcomed, even if it was uncomfortable. But perhaps most telling was the way Jamiltón himself moved through this period. There were no grand interviews, no follow-up outbursts. Just presence. Calm, focused presence in the garage. Review sessions with purpose. Technical briefings where he asked sharp, specific questions that made it clear he was not only engaged, but listening for the truth. This was not the behavior of a man trying to escalate conflict. This was the approach of someone trying to rebuild from within. What began as a moment of frustration over the radio had evolved into something far more disruptive. A demand for professional respect in an industry that too often takes experience for granted. And in doing so, Jamiltón proved something else entirely. He was not at Ferrari to be a ceremonial addition. He was there to challenge, to elevate, and most of all, to hold people accountable, even when they wore red. In the quiet aftermath of Lewis Jamilton's unexpected yet piercing stand, one truth remained crystal clear. The seven-time world champion had not joined Ferrari to quietly retire into the shadows. He had come to disrupt, to uncover, and to force a legendary institution to face its contradictions. His message to his engineer, though delivered in the heat of the moment, had been the ignition for something much greater than a single incident. It had become a mirror held up to the soul of the team. A mirror that revealed bias, complacency, and a dangerous reliance on internal politics dressed as strategy. What Jamilton accomplished was not just a technical correction or a demand for better radio protocols. It was a cultural detonation. One that sent a very public warning to any team, not just Ferrari, that no amount of history or prestige can shield you from accountability. And the fact that this call-out came from one of the most respected figures in the sport only magnified its weight. It was not petty. It was not emotional. It was surgical. As fans, we often glorify the spectacle on the track, but rarely do we appreciate the battles fought behind the pit wall. Battles of politics, ego, and the silent sabotage of indifference. Jamilton has now pulled back that curtain, and the image it revealed is one many hoped would stay hidden. A champion whose feedback was deprioritized. A team that, despite claiming balance, bent toward favoritism. And an engineer who, whether knowingly or not, became the face of a deeper dysfunction. This chapter may not carry the glamour of a trophy or the celebration of a podium, but it may be Jamilton's most valuable contribution yet. In challenging Ferrari's inner workings, he has reignited the conversation about driver treatment, communication equity, and the price of silence. And perhaps, for the first time in years, the myth of Ferrari has been pierced. Not out of malice, but by the sheer force of truth. Whatever happens next, one thing is certain. Lewis Jamilton did not come to wear red. He came to redefine what it means. And in doing so, he has left an impression on Ferrari that no checkered flag could ever match.